This podcast is recorded at Windsor Public Library, which sits on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations and includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. We respect and honor First Nations' long-standing relationship to the land along the Detroit River in what is now called Windsor-Essex County.
Welcome back to Stories of Windsor, a podcast celebrating the rich history of our community by the river. On this episode, we'll be acknowledging Windsor's distinct location as a gateway to the United States, a home to one of the busiest international borders in the world. With a river separating our two nations, without tunnels or bridges, cross-border travel wouldn't be possible, especially to the degree that those of us who live in Windsor are used to. With the new Gordie Howie International Bridge set to open any time now, we thought we'd kick off our 2026 podcast season discussing a topic that practically courses through every Windsorite's veins, getting across the border. And Mary Lou, you're going to kick us off with the underground way of getting to the United States.
Thank you. Most people, when they think of a tunnel between Windsor and Detroit, they think of the automotive tunnel that was created in 1930. However, before that, there was another tunnel that was built underneath the Detroit River, now known as the MCR Tunnel or the Michigan Central Railway Tunnel. It was a tunnel to do shipping for trains. Now, this was a very, very complicated project, considering that it was originally attempted in 1871, 60 years prior to the creation of the tunnel that we now know. The motivation for this came from the expansion of the railway system, which was bringing in huge amounts of shipping, quantities of materials that would, everything from, construction and lumber to grains to fresh fruit. Through the expansion that took place, and that itself is very complicated and very lengthy, so I'm not going to go into that. There was this major need to improve on a way to ship it. And the problem is that in order to ship something across the river, you would need a ferry. And this wasn't your typical ferry that we think of bringing people across. This was built so that they would actually have to lift all of the equipment that came out of the train, or the items. They would take all of those items, ship them on top of a ferry, and then when they got over to Detroit, they would have to unpack the entire ferry itself. This was very, very time consuming. This was an amazing amount of work. Through the years, they managed to find ways. They had something called a swing, which would help lift up larger items, and they could crank it on. So originally, though, it started by hand, literally moving these things by hand. But over time, the necessity of expanding the ferry service was obvious. And by the time they started trying to think of how they could do this, how they could take a tunnel, because they went through what kind of bridge should we build, how will the ice flows, like all of these things were coming in their mind. They were very aware of it. At that time, they already had 14 ferries running between Detroit and Windsor. And some of them could carry 10 or 20 or 8 huge contents of trains. So just visualize one train and think of 8 trains being put on that, except it's all materials. So this was a massive problem, especially because of the increase in need. There were also passengers. They were needing more ferries for passengers to go across. There was a need for families that people worked there. So there was both a personal and an economic need for this. So one of the first problems was by 1870, the ferries in Windsor-Detroit handled 15,000 passenger cars, 400,000 freight cars, and that was only a small percentage of
incredible.
What the market.
That's absolutely incredible.
Any kind of disruption in either railroad service, like shipping, or ferry service, it could destroy a town or city because of the lack of materials. Eventually, it was recognized that they needed to have a different way of doing these things, that they needed to create this tunnel, and that was the first idea. In 1869, Cornelius Vanderbilt and James F. Joy got together, and Vanderbilt, the railway tycoon, to come up with an idea. And they did a study. They bored down into the bedrock of the tunnel, and they were like, yeah, we can do this, no problem. This should be easy. And this was right at St. Antoine Street in Detroit, and across from it, it was at Parent Avenue.
Okay.
In Windsor. Okay, we're going to have 2 rain tracks, and they can be this long, and we'll have masonry as the walls. You know what? It's not going to cost us anything. It's going to be really easy to make. They found bedrock. They said, okay, yeah, look, we've got 110 feet below the surface. It's good. It's got clay. It'll be easy to do. And then they came under boulders and hard rock and granite, and they realized they were not going to be able to do this. They went through a number of other ideas, and in 1871, the groundbreaking ceremonies were held for this new tunnel. The science behind it, I'm not going to get into the engineering, but they sunk 2 vertical shafts at the same time, and they were 3,275 feet apart from each other, so on each side. They were dug towards opposite shores, and what happened is they couldn't get it through. They were like, what's wrong? Why can't we do this? They just didn't have the engineering expertise at the time. What ended up happening was when they started trying to keep on working, they found that they were dying of gas exposure, quicksand. They would hit those boulders. Everything that could go wrong did. Quite a few people actually died in 1872 because there was no air ventilation. So they died of sulfur poisoning. They just decided, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. This project's gone. And there was a lot of debate about, let's make a bridge, let's do this, let's do that, and the big thing was, let's make bridges, let's do that, which I think is kind of interesting. But they couldn't decide what kind. So one person wanted to build a drawbridge, but there was problems with, well, will that be high enough? And will it be balanced? And all these technical issues. And they just would argue and argue. And then one guy pulled out his money and another guy pulled out his money. This does not sound uncommon. And they finally said, forget this. We're not going to do this. All they did was everybody opposed each other. There was just no way to do something. There were also several examples of attempts to tunnel under the river near Stony Island using the same concepts, and it didn't work out. There's too much danger. They didn't have the right engineering. So the project actually proceeded through the availability of engineering. Even at that time, Walker, our famous J.H. Walker, thought that maybe he could take his railway and incorporate this into the tunnel. And so, there was local interest as well. It's no coincidence that certain choices were made that coincided with certain rail companies. So let's just say they had the one up on other ones. They finally decided that this was a project they'd have to just put aside for now and think about it later. What happened was, at the same time, there was something called the St. Clair Tunnel that was built there. They had a man who understood how to get through what they call blue clay, which is dominant in there as well as at the Detroit River. And he was able to create a way for them to do this. Now, there was also dangers in that as well. And in 1891, they managed to accomplish this. And so they ended up getting this tunnel built before what we would call our underground tunnel. And it was a massive engineering accomplishment. It was discussed around the world. They had their problems too. They had quite a few people die in the process. It was not an easy job, obviously. Actually, they had 2 failed attempts. And it was when they tried in 1888 that they managed to get past those. But they had the exact same problems that was in the Detroit River. They finally had this engineer, and it confirmed that they could do this, that this was safe, and they could do this. So the tunnel itself, people were, they were impressed. It was part of what I call like the craze of the tunnel building, which was happening across all around the world. So between like the 1870s and the 1890s, every country in the world were building tunnels. There was an attempt to build tunnels during the Boer War. The channel that we all know now was originally attempted. So this was not an uncommon thing. There were a lot of demands, and financially, it was starting to affect Detroit, because now although we still had ferry service to do this, all of a sudden things that would have traditionally gone through the Detroit River were now going up to the St. Clair Tunnel. and they started losing a
Mm.
lot more money. And also the passenger traffic. People would take the train up to Sarnia and get on and go there to visit in northern in Michigan, and then they could take a train back down. Like, it was actually not that inconvenient with our mindset it would be, but for them.
Yeah, for that time period.
For that time period. So eventually there was something called the Detroit Car Ferry Service, and they were still trying to get things back and forth. They were trying to do passengers only, cars only. That wasn't working. And finally, they said, we've got to get back on track. We've got to do this. So in 1905, they finally decided to build this tunnel. Numerous groups worked together, eventually known as the Detroit Ferry Company. They were handling 1,097 rail cars a day in 1905. So,
Wow.
yeah.
So this literally went back and forth for 30 years.
Yeah, I mean, when Windsor and Detroit were able to do this, it was, absolutely insane how fast they made this. They were actually an average rate of 4,000 cubic yards of earth per day of 12 hours were lifted out. So the massive implications here, we don't think of those things. We don't think that they're capable of it. When they were dredging, they originally started to dredge just at 3,000 cubic yards. But then when they were doing a good job, it was 4,000. So eventually cold weather set in. And so they had to wait till it was warmer. The ice would become ice flows. And it was really hard for boats to even go through, which is one of the reasons why the drawbridge project was canceled. There was no way that these people are going to be able to go down into that river without seriously hurting themselves.
Yeah, it used to be thick enough you could drive on it.
Yeah. And I mean, there was a time where they called it a shaft and they dropped it into the river. Everybody, big party, like every time something was done, it was with enthusiasm and real love. The whole public absolutely loved it. There was full support of the community behind this. It was something that was resulted in one way or the other. Each side had their own designs. And when coming out of the tunnel itself was consistent. The project was started in 1905. It was completed in 1909. And what they used was electric trains to pull the ferry cars into the tunnel. And they did this because there was no ventilation systems that they could use, because if they didn't and they used coal, you're going to suffocate. This was actually the way they moved items until the 50s.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I did
it was
not know
that in 1920, 900,000 cars a year were handled through the tunnel on 2 tracks. In 1909, 735,753 cars were ferried. So it shows you in 10 years the increments and how major it was changed. The trains were powered by volt current of 600, and they were operated from a Windsor yards to the Detroit yards. Each had their own electrical station. In 1953, the electric system was replaced by another form. Right now, it was owned by the CPR. But if we think about, how many clearances in that had to go through, there were various times where they had to do improvements, especially in regards to ventilation. These cars were going through like this tunnel with, lamp lights originally. You didn't have, they were literally hanging lamp lights to get through. Passengers would get off at Brush Street in Detroit and go off, and they actually charged train fees. So if you were a passenger, you would pay this amount, but if you were shipping, you pay this. So both passengers and were on the same trains as the things being shipped. I'm just going to speculate that it wasn't the cleanest way to get across the river.
Might have been a rough
trip, yeah. What's happened today is people don't even realize it's there. We don't see much of it. It's not something that is apparent unless you live by the rail yards that are there. And it has been for many, many years, on and off, different owners, different people taking it over. And in 2020, Canada Pacific acquired the whole ownership, basically sold it to a company that also is in charge of Amtrak. Nowadays, about 400,000 rail cars are used. So it shows you the difference in technology and usage. And there have been years for the last probably 15 years, there has been discussion in making it simply a passenger rail.
Oh,
so
really?
In 2021, they put that whole project aside, and it is still in the works. It's still considered a possible project. So when you hear it being closed down, there are still things coming through. There's a different owner. It's not as much used as it once was, but there is a goal to make this into an entire train to go from one side to the other as an alternative transport of the bridge in the current tunnel we have.
So with Amtrak taking some ownership of it, does that
Yeah.
mean like you can get an Amtrak train here? Is that the idea? And you can like go to Chicago or something?
Well, that's basically what they're saying, to connect into different. That's when I read the
Ah.
proposal that I could get on, because it was really hard to find any information about this. Amtrak proposed an idea that it would connect with other tracks so that they can go all over the US. It would be like how
Right.
we do it with Via Rail.
Right. That's
Yeah.
what I was thinking. Yeah.
But it would be an international way for that to take place. And it would be in the busiest international crossing in the world, which is here.
Mhm.
So to take advantage of that. So right now, you can go down between Cameron and Wellington and go for a walk along the riverside, and you can take a look. It's still there. Right now, it's kind of in limbo. And
Which is why I think everyone forgets about it. The
Oh, yeah.
tunnel is always the tunnel, like the main focus, the main tunnel that we have downtown.
Yeah, and it's two different tunnels, like
yeah.
one going through and back. I want to end on this. The Windsor side of the tunnel was not as pretty as where it ended on the American side. The American side built up like a bridge in certain areas. And Windsor, well, working man town, that's how they left it. Like you can even today,
Very
there-
practical.
it was very practical, and that's what it still looks like today. So really, when you go down there, you look at it, you're really looking at the same tunnel that probably was updated in like 1953.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Remind me, when did it open officially?
on July 1st, 1910.
1910.
And it started being built October 1st, 1905. So
It takes 4 years to build a tunnel.
yes, the technology was completely different from what they did at the St. Clair Tunnel because of the problems that they had with the currents in the Detroit River. The type of it wasn't just blue clay; it had salt, because there's salt underneath the Detroit River, so that would be part of it. Some of the technology that was used to build this was actually used by the Canadian Salt Company, which became Windsor Salt, to mine salt. So it was really something that not only contributed to the shipping and the passenger and the international economy, but actually created options for further companies to develop as well.
So 1910 it opened.
Yes.
1930.
35,
When did the tunnel we still use now was 1930 or 1929?
1930.
So 20 odd years later we get the one we still use now.
Yeah.
And the year before we got the bridge.
Yes.
And that's going to swing over to Carla and we're going to talk about the Ambassador Bridge.
So, I'm going to talk to you about the history of the Ambassador Bridge. But before I delve into the history of it, you know I like to shout out the sources I used when I researched this segment of the podcast. So, my primary sources were, as usual, the Border City Star and the Windsor Daily Star, which are available online through the Windsor Public Library collection of e-resources under ProQuest Historical Newspapers. I also used a great book in our collection called The Ambassador Bridge, A Monument to Progress by Philip P. Mason. That was published in 1987. And I also used a very special primary document that we have here at the local history branch called The Detroit-Windsor Bridge by Charles Fowler. Published in 1928, it outlines the bridge in its planning stages and contains conceptual drawings and figures of the bridge before it was even named Ambassador. Lastly, there's some great information online, good reliable information available through the Detroit Historical Society. So with that, let's get into the history of the Ambassador Bridge, a Windsor-Detroit icon since 1929. The Ambassador Bridge, which spans the Detroit River between Windsor and Detroit, opened to the public on November 11, 1929. The project cost more than $23 million, which in today's currency would be somewhere in the realm of $400 to $500 million. The design features both Art Deco and Gothic inspiration, and the bridge's total length is 2.286 kilometers. It is built mainly of steel and has a roadway that rises as high as 46.5 meters above the Detroit River. But how did it come to be, and what stories are linked to this important international crossing? And I think a bigger question is, why a bridge? And Mary Lou kind of touched on, a bridge was sort of in the works or under discussion for some time. Industrialization was booming in Detroit and in Windsor in the early 1900s. The automotive industry was rapidly growing, and with it, the population along the Detroit River. For example, in 1929, the Border City Star reported that Sandwich, which was the Canadian terminal to the bridge, had increased in population from 3,000 in the early 1920s to 11,800 by 1929. There was a great hope that the bridge would have economic benefits on both sides of the river, including the building of new real estate and housing projects to cater to this growing population. Before the arrival of the bridge, there was only ferry service to get cars and pedestrians across the river. As the population grew, lineups to access the ferries became long and unmanageable. A rail tunnel, like Mary Lou described, had already opened in 1910 to ease some of the cargo traffic across the river, but commuters and travelers were still looking for something to ease the wait times for the ferries. The bridge plan came forward in the mid-1920s by American businessman John W. Austin. Talk of building a bridge had been circulating for years, if not decades, but Austin is the only one who finally came forth with a solid plan. He met with the partners at the McClintock Marshall Company of Pittsburgh to discuss the construction of an international bridge spanning the Detroit River. This engineering firm would eventually go on to build the famous Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, so they were quite an esteemed group.
That also explains why the towers kind of look the same.
Yes, there's
Yeah,
a
the Art
definite
Deco,
similarity.
yeah.
The engineers loved the idea, but they needed funds. Austin also cleared the plans with transit authorities on both sides of the river, but again, nobody had the money to fund it. Michigan didn't want to fund it. Ontario didn't want to fund it. So Austin approached Detroit financier Joseph A. Bauer with the plan for the bridge. And Bauer was, I think he was originally from New York, and he was kind of known to be a guy who swept in and rescued companies that were struggling. He had just lots of money, and he would swoop in, rescue a company, and then profit from it. And that's exactly what he was going to do here. Bauer loved the idea of a bridge, and he came up with the necessary funds, which equaled $23.5 million. However, Detroit's mayor, John Smith, actively opposed the building of a privately owned bridge and tried to halt the project. Why did he not want the bridge? It sounds counterintuitive if it's going to solve problems. His reason was he found it troubling that basically the electorate, the people, would be financing this bridge. They would be paying all this money in tolls to cross the bridge, and it would just end up in the pockets of this wealthy man, Joseph Bauer. It wouldn't go back to them as Michiganders, or here in Ontario, it wouldn't come to us. And of course, when it's in private hands, you can't control the maintenance of the bridge either. Okay, so that was his worry. So they put it to a vote. They put it in a referendum vote in 1927, and Detroiters overwhelmingly voted in favor of the bridge construction, as did residents here in Windsor-Essex County. So construction began right away in 1927, and by April of 1928, Bauer was thinking about a name for this bridge, which to this point they had been calling the very boring Detroit-Windsor International Bridge. Bauer felt it lacked any emotional appeal, and I would agree.
Yes.
Bauer finally landed on the name Ambassador Bridge because, and I'm going to quote him directly, "I thought of the bridge as an ambassador between the two countries. I want it to symbolize the visible expression of friendship of two peoples with like ideas and ideals." And that quote comes from the Mason book I mentioned earlier.
It's actually quite nice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The Ambassador Bridge was completed in 1929, approximately 9 months ahead of schedule. Can you believe that? A project finished ahead of schedule.
Not being
Unbelievable.
blocked by anything.
Nothing.
And not by a private owner.
No, the private owner forged ahead in this case.
It can be done.
It can be done.
And so in 1929, the Ambassador Bridge became the largest international suspension bridge in the world. So let's talk about the opening. The bridge was dedicated on November 11th, 1929, on Remembrance Day, or Armistice Day as it was called back then. And they chose this date as a symbol of 114 years of peaceful relations between Canada and the US. If you're doing the math, that goes back to the War of 1812. 50,000 spectators gathered on the Windsor side of the bridge and double that number on the Detroit side. So there were speeches, there were parades all day. There was a ribbon-cutting ceremony, which was done by the wives of the bridge officials on both sides of the river. But before the ribbons were cut, Mason, the author I mentioned earlier, he notes that a huge crowd of pedestrians couldn't contain their excitement any longer, and they began rushing on foot toward the middle of the bridge. Tens of thousands of people rushed the bridge, broke through the rope barriers, and walked on when they weren't supposed to. And you have to imagine, this was such a novel idea for the residents on both sides of the river. It's hard for us to imagine the Windsor skyline without the river, but it wasn't there. So the idea of being able to climb onto a bridge and stand so high above the water, it was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. They laughed and they sang songs and they had a great time marching along with the military bands that were also part of the celebrations. The police had a very hard time containing the crowd as people began even to climb up on the catwalks on sort of the either side.
People were fearless back then.
I know.
Yes. And those were several hundred feet above the water, so wild to me to imagine that. And luckily, no one was injured. The Ambassador Bridge was considered to be an engineering marvel and opened to great success. So listen to these numbers, okay? Between November 15th and December 6th, so less than 1 month, just under 125 vehicles crossed the bridge, 3,413 trucks, 53,000 pedestrians, and buses carried over 20,000 passengers over the bridge. So obviously there was great excitement about this new bridge. So you may be wondering at this point, what were the tolls like to cross the bridge in 1929? What did it cost travelers to use this beautiful new engineering marvel? The tolls were like those of their direct competitors, the Detroit-Windsor Ferry Service and the Walkerville-Detroit Ferry. So I'm going to just spit out some numbers here. The most common way to cross was in an automobile. Automobile drivers paid 50 cents plus an additional 5 cents per passenger. Motorcyclists paid 25 cents. Baby carriages, 10 cents. I don't know. I'm not sure. I got a visual of a rogue baby carriage just flying across the river. But buses cost between $1.75 and $3 plus 5 cents per passenger. A saddle, horse, and rider, 30 cents. Because that's right, not everybody had a car yet in 1929.
Now, did they charge for the horse, though?
Oh, yes, they did.
I love everything about that. Just
Yes.
the picture of that in my brain.
It gets better. It gets
Okay.
better. Transport trucks and cargo vehicles paid by 100-pound units of gross weight. So you had to be weighed as you crossed the river. Commuters could buy tickets in bulk at a reduced rate. The Border City Star noted that motor commuters could pay $15 a month, or they could get an annual book of 50 tickets for $20. Back then, pedestrians could cross the bridge on foot, and they paid 5 cents. Horses and cattle could be led across at specified times under permit for 20 cents a head.
It's got better.
Yes. So, like, we can't even bring groceries across, like meat and produce.
Yeah, the question now, do you have any meat or
Yes,
cheese products?
but
Well, his
get
name
across.
is Henry.
Yeah. That's just like,
His name is...
I think that's amazing. Although people weren't bringing their cattle and horses across by this point, pedestrians could cross on foot up to the year 2001. It was prohibited after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. So that brings us to the Great Depression. Despite the Ambassador Bridge becoming an engineering marvel and receiving tons of traffic in its first month of use, the timing of the bridge could not have been worse. It opened just as the largest economic downturn in history was beginning, the Great Depression. And the Great Depression greatly impacted the new bridge in ways that people could not imagine. Widespread unemployment and even just the fear of job loss led to a sharp decline in travel, recreation, and tourism. More than 10,000 Windsor workers lost their jobs in Michigan because the U.S. implemented restrictions on non-residents seeking employment in America as a means of protecting jobs for their own citizens. That's 10,000 commuters a day no longer needing to cross the bridge. That's a big hit. By 1934, only 586,000 vehicles crossed the bridge over 1 year. Compare that to the first month when we see over 125,000 cars alone crossing, in addition to the buses, trucks, pedestrians. So add this trouble of the Great Depression to the fact that new competition was presented with the opening of the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel in 1930, plus the ferry services also noted a decline in ridership, so they slashed their fees in half as a way of trying to keep their customer base. So there were a lot of strikes against the bridge in its very early days. However, things turned around by the start of World War II as the war effort began to mobilize as early as 1939. A report from November 10, 1944 in the Windsor Daily Star states that over the last 3 years, so since about 1940 or 41, approximately 75,000 trucks a year passed over the bridge carrying all types of material just for the war effort. Anything from food to steel to airplane wings to universal carriers and even light tanks. Those materials were coming in as far away as Chicago, New York, and the Atlantic coast. In short, the war effort greatly helped the bridge to rebound, and that continued well into the 1950s. The 1950s presented itself with a very prosperous time in both Windsor and Detroit.
Like post-war.
Post-war period, yeah. When I researched that, I couldn't find a photograph of it, but I would love to see a photograph of airplane wings fully built crossing the bridge.
Yeah.
That would be cool, seeing
Yeah.
it on a carrier.
Yes.
In addition to the history of the bridge, I thought it would be cool to hear a couple of interesting stories related to the bridge that are probably lesser known, but very interesting, I think. So the first story is about the sinking of the British freighter, the MV Montrose, and this happened directly under the Ambassador Bridge. It happened on the night of July 30th, 1962, when it crashed into a barge near the bridge. Although the crew got off the boat safely and no one was injured, the boat was toast. As it capsized and flopped onto its side, huge crowds of people gathered on both sides of the river to watch. Tens of thousands of people and many pedestrians who paid to walk onto the bridge to get a bird's eye view of the event. They witnessed this capsizing of the ship. According to the Windsor Star, the 440-foot ship, long ship, was valued at between $6 and $8 million and was coming from France carrying fine wine and tons of aluminum, which they had already successfully unloaded in Detroit the day before the crash. In the fall, the ship was salvaged from the 30 feet of water in which it was sitting, and they were able to refloat it and get it out of the water, and this effort cost a grand total of $750,000. The next story is about a massive Canada-wide student protest that took place in October of 1969 at both the Detroit-Windsor Tunnel and the Ambassador Bridge. The idea was to create blockades in key locations in protest of the American nuclear testing in the Aleutian Islands, which are off the coast of Alaska and northern BC, and which are located on an earthquake fault line. The islands were and are, to this day, a wildlife refuge, and there was great fear that these nuclear blasts, would cause earthquakes and tsunamis that would impact the Canadian coast and span as far away as Asia. The headquarters for this protest was set up in Victoria, BC, and from there they coordinated over 20,000 students across Canada, including those at St. Clair College and the University of Windsor. The students picketed at airports in Halifax, Regina, and Winnipeg. Roads were blocked in Woodstock, New Brunswick, which bordered the state of Maine, as well as border crossings at Lennoxville and Champlain between Quebec and New York. They gathered in Niagara Falls, Sarnia, and the Ambassador Bridge, and many other places. So you can see from this list, they were targeting border crossings as points of disruption for Americans, very visible spots where they could make their point. In total, about 250 students from the college picketed at the entrance of the tunnel, and 400 from the University of Windsor peacefully protested at the entrance to the Ambassador Bridge from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. on October 1st, 1969. They carried signs that read, "Don't poison our air," and "We don't want U.S. fallout," and they sang the song "Give Peace a Chance" by John Lennon and Yoko Ono as they began their protest at the bridge. The protest went off with few problems, minus some really pissed off drivers who were in a hurry to cross the bridge. I read one that one person even complained that their dinner was at home burning, so they got to go. Unfortunately, it was all for naught, and the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission still went ahead with their nuclear blast on October 2nd, the day after the protest. Thankfully, it did not cause an earthquake or tidal wave, but I think it's a really cool story, and it's really neat that such a large-scale protest happened right here at the Ambassador Bridge. It's a reflection of that time period when so much activism was happening in North America, the late 1960s, civil rights, women's liberation, anti-Vietnam, and so many more. And it shows how important Windsor was and still is to international relations. The Ambassador Bridge is still privately owned, as the Bauer family, who owned it in the beginning, they sold it to Maddie Maroon in 1979. Although Maddie passed away in 2020, the bridge remains in the hands of the Maroon family. About 10,000 to 15,000 vehicles and about 1/4 of all trade between the US and Canada passes over this bridge every single day, making it North America's busiest international border crossing. And that's probably why the Maroon family has spent years and millions of dollars fighting against the building of the Gordie Howe International Bridge, because they will likely see a big dip in traffic and revenue once it opens. There are free resources online if you want to see some very cool visuals of the Ambassador Bridge. You can watch silent films from the 1920s showing the building of the bridge on YouTube. The Internet Archive also has a lot of material about the bridge, as does the Southwestern Ontario Digital Archive, or SWODA as we call it. It has many cool photos in their collection which are free to access.
As you mentioned, Carla, as this episode is titled Two Bridges and a Tunnel, it probably goes without saying that we're going to also be talking about the new bridge, the Gordie Howe International Bridge. Before I proceed, though, I would be remiss not to address the latest quote-unquote dispute associated with the new bridge. We're recording this episode on Wednesday, February 11th. 2 days ago, on the evening of Monday, February 9th, U.S. President Donald Trump made a statement on his Truth Social account threatening to block the opening of the bridge. The very next day, news outlets around the world picked up the story, and Windsor-Detroit was once again thrust into the global spotlight. While this new development is frustrating, I will not get into the political back and forth around the issue, and instead will focus strictly on the facts surrounding the project that built the Gordie Howe Bridge and how we, as the most economically significant international border in the world, will rely on it to strengthen the partnership between Canada and the United States. So I have pulled my information directly from the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority website. I will also add that I once worked for the WDBA, as it's more commonly referred to. I did a contract in their communications department in the Access to Information and Privacy Division. That involved analyzing and reviewing documents associated with information and privacy requests within the parameters of the Federal Privacy and Access to Information Acts. I can, with confidence, say that the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority is a well-oiled machine that values transparency. So I would encourage anyone who wants to know more about our new bridge to please check out their website directly at www.gordiehoweinternationalbridge.com. So here are the facts. The contract value of the bridge is $6.4 billion in Canadian money. Gone up in price a little bit since the other two.
Yeah.
Since the other bridge and the tunnel. Canada covered the entire cost. While we will receive the profits initially, once the money to cover the cost of the bridge to build the bridge is made, future profits will then be shared between the two countries. This massive undertaking was made possible through a public-private partnership, often referred to as a P3 partnership. What that means in business speak is a, quote, long-term contractual agreement between a public authority and a private party, in this case the federal government and the contractors called Bridging North America, to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain a public infrastructure. The project contains 4 main components: the bridge, the U.S. port of entry, the Canadian port of entry, and the Michigan interchange. The Michigan interchange involved local road improvements, including 4 new road bridges, 3 new pedestrian bridges, widening roads to allow transport trucks to turn easier, and building primary connectors to the I-75 interchanges. Again, I will reiterate that Canada paid for all of this in partnership with the state of Michigan. The official building of the bridge started on October 5th, 2018. To date, it is in the top 5 of longest bridges in North America. The Canadian port of entry is one of the largest land ports of entry along the Canada-US border and one of the largest anywhere in North America. The ports of entry on both sides of the border have been designed so they can be expanded in the future if necessary. The bridge is made of mainly concrete and steel with a cable-stayed design. American steel was used to build it. The bridge created 2,500 jobs, many of whom are union workers from both sides of the border. The bridge itself is named after famed hockey player Gordie Howe. Kind of goes without saying. In the late 2010, David Bradley, president of the Ontario Trucking Association, proposed naming the bridge in honor of Howe, who played the bulk of his career for the Detroit Red Wings. The naming was supported by a number of Canadian politicians, along with Howe's son Marty, who felt the name was extra symbolic given that his dad was from Canada but spent the bulk of his NHL career playing in Detroit. I believe Gordie Howe passed away 2 years before construction began, but he did know that the bridge was going to be named after him, and he felt very honored by that. As an added nod to the sport that Gordie Howe loved, the bridge's pillars are shaped to reflect the curvature of a hockey stick in a slap shot.
Wow.
So it took me a minute to actually figure that out, but if you look at it closely, it's a very significant sort of way that it goes from wide to narrow, and the way it's curved, you can loosely see that it does represent that, which was a fact I did not know.
And that, you know what, that probably adds to the beauty. Like it's not just like a stand-up bridge, like it adds its own.
It's very symbolic in its
symbolic.
naming and its connection. There's a lot of symbolism associated with this bridge, and I think the partnerships and the community outreach projects that the Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority have done have tried to establish the fact that this is not just a giant business project. This is literally joining 2 nations and 2 communities together. Now the numbers. The bridge is 123 feet wide, including an 11 by 8 foot multi-use path. So this one you can walk and bike across. It spans 2.5 kilometers, 0.28 kilometers, 2.7 kilometers longer than the Ambassador Bridge. So it spans 2.8 kilometers and rises 150 feet above the river, and each pillar or tower is 722 feet high. There are 6 traffic lanes plus the multi-use path, which has a green surface that is skid resistant and retro-reflective, and the path has been designated as part of the Trans-Canada Trail system.
Well, that's cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah. There are 16 toll lanes with manual, automatic, and electronic toll collection. The Canadian port of entry has 24 inspection lanes, whereas the U.S. port of entry has 36. It is kitted out with the latest technology. And I think this is where it's going to really sort of knock the Ambassador Bridge kind of off the convenience map, I hate to say, because it has direct connections to all the major highways on both the Canadian and American side. So you can just slide up the 401 instead of going through around University of Windsor, right up to the bridge. And then they have all the connectors on the other side to I-75, so you can head right down to the southern states. It is expected to save transport trucks, this is crazy, 850,000 hours per year just waiting at the border.
Oh my God.
That's how kitted out this is with tech. To reiterate how substantial that is, 1/4 of all US and Canada trade pass through the Windsor-Detroit corridor. It is literally the artery for trade and supply chains for North America. As of the recording of this episode, the Gordie Howe International Bridge is 98% done. In a news release from the WDBA website, the bridge and its ports of entry must go through a testing and commissioning process to ensure that the bridge is fully operational and can be fully operational. This involves the inspecting, testing, adjusting, and retesting the systems required to operate the Gordie Howe International Bridge to, quote, make sure they work as intended on their own and as part of a fully integrated system across all components of the project, end quote. Since its technologies are using interconnected, complex, binational transportation systems, it is vital that they are working at peak and reliable efficiency. There are so many projects, partnerships, and community connections involved in building the Gordie Howe International Bridge that they're just too numerous to mention in detail in the short time we have in this episode. Throughout the entire building period, detailed attention was given to environmental and neighborhood impacts. But as we are recording this episode live from the Windsor Public Library's local history branch, which is located in the heart of Sandwich Town, I would like to, in the very least, highlight the community impact projects that Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority has supported in the Sandwich area. In fact, the WDBA operates one of their community offices out of the old post office building at the corner of Sandwich and Mill. Between 2023 and 2024, there were 3 major roadwork reconstruction projects completed in Sandwich, along with $1 million put towards neighborhood enhancements, including landscaping and parkette spaces. On and around the bridge, visual projects have been commissioned in regular intervals throughout the different stages of the building process. At the base of the tower on the Canadian side, an artistic facade has been carved into the concrete. Freestanding works of art at the Canadian Port of Entry pay respect to the Indigenous peoples whose land the bridge is built on. I strongly encourage our listeners to check out the Gordie Howie International Bridge website for more information about these projects, even just to view the artist's renderings. They're absolutely extraordinary. Well, at this point, we have no definite timeline as to when the bridge will open officially. Things are starting to happen that are more noticeable. For those driving west along the EC Road Expressway, you may have noticed that there are new signs indicating entry points for the Gordie Howe International Bridge above the roadway near the Ojibwe Parkway exit. So, who knows when it's going to open now? I don't want to say more than that because everything seems to be changing on a dime nowadays. But like the lights are on, the signs are up, everything's ready to go. It's just we need the green light. I'm very curious to see once it opens how it is received, because while there is tension between the Ambassador and the Gordie Howe Bridge, it's going to be a hard argument not to say that it's going to be more convenient to use the Gordie Howe Bridge because of how kitted out it is with technology. Mm-hmm. It's supposed to be a super streamlined. You can walk across it. You can bike across it. It has emergency lanes in the middle for emergency vehicles. Accident happens on the bridge. There's an emergency lane already there. Somebody has to get across to the hospital. There's already an emergency lane there. The only thing I don't really like about the new bridge is that it's right next to Zug Island. Yes. And it's not the best way to welcome yourself to Detroit. So yes,
maybe they'll plant a lot of flowers.
Maybe. I mean, they've done a lot of artwork on both sides. They've tried to beautify it as much as possible, but I guess we're in a wait and see situation.
I think it's also very interesting that once they announced, or they basically were confirmed, maybe not publicly announced, there were other projects being put forward, and one was a $400 million underground tunnel, another one. And that was put on hold once, it probably won't come back. But it's also fascinating to see how the technology has so quickly advanced. And also how well it has sustained. You know, the Ambassador Bridge is very old. I'm very, very, I have my heart. I love the architecture, and I've had so many good memories crossing that bridge. I'm fortunate enough to live in the West End where I get to see both. You know, and it is, I'm looking so forward to handing my passport over and saying, okay, let me take a look at this.
Take a ride across it. I think there's been so much buildup around it. I'm not saying we're going to have 60,000 people walk to the bridge and try to take pictures and selfies on it. I mean, I don't know, could be. But I think once it finally does open, given that we're in year 8 now of it actually being built, and I mean, it's been probably more than double that since it's been as a concept and a thought. I think it was early 2000s when this was actually presented. It was named in 2010, so it's definitely been before then. I think once it does open, people are going to be really curious, just because there's just been so much talk around it, and it's become such an international focus of late. I think locally, people are going to be very interested to see. Proud. Yeah, I mean, it is a pretty bridge. I'm not going to lie. It's a pretty bridge.
It's very pretty. I encourage anyone to go down to Brock Park on Russell Street in Sandwich, because if you look to your left, you can see the new Gordie Howe Bridge, and if you look to your right, you can see the Ambassador Bridge, and they're so close to each other. Actually, it's just very cool to see the old and the new together. I also think the pedestrian walkway over the bridge, over the Gordie Howe Bridge, is going to be of great value if we ever do get that urban national park at Ojibwe.
With that, I think we'll wrap it up with our 2 bridges and a tunnel. And thank you, ladies. It's always a joy, and we look forward to another year of exploring Windsor's history.